Greetings from Castle Goring, from Ricky, Aurora and from me. I have an awful lot of ground to cover today. Some of it is going to be hopefully entertaining and amusing and enlivening, and then some of it is going to be really serious. So let me warn those of you who don't want anything serious. It comes at the end, so don't look. But if you're interested in what's really important, it comes at the end. I'm saving the most important for the last. And we will start with Brenda Stashkovsky, or then Brenda Stajkowski. But I suspect, I don't know how she pronounces it. I have a feeling it's a Polish name that's been transferred to America, and it might not be pronounced in the Polish fashion. So bear with me if I'm wrong. Brenda Stajkowska is what it really should be. Says I be pedantic, I'm sorry. But I suspect you're American, so I don't know. So anyway, bear with me, please, and forgive me if I've got it wrong. The addition to Harry's lawsuit and now drawing in of senior members surely must add to King Charles' health and stress levels. To put it mildly, he has done nothing to deserve this. I very much doubt any of the royal family will ever have anything to do with Harry again. After everything he put Prince Philip and the Queen through, he is still attacking the monarchy. What a disgusting creature. Well, I couldn't agree more. Harry is a hateful, hate-filled pedant who is clearly drug-addled and irresponsible and delusional and very disturbed and disturbing. And I pity anybody who has to deal with him. He is actually repellent, in my view. But you know, let's remember, one man's ceiling is another man's floor. One man's distress can be another man's exaltation. Harry might be hoping for a beneficial outcome to himself and regards what he's doing as worthwhile because it's going to have a positive outcome for him. Possibly. He's convinced himself he's slaying dragons, which is ridiculous. First of all, newspapers suffered serious consequences as a result of their criminal activity, and it was quite right that they would suffer serious consequences. But let's make no mistake about it. The consequences were extremely severe. The most popular newspaper and one of the oldest newspapers in the country was shut down, the News of the World. There was a culture of criminality. Several members of staff went to prison and others were tried and got away with the skin of their teeth. Rupert Murdoch has had to pay out hundreds of millions, maybe even £1 billion now, to settle all the previous criminality. Why, now that they have cleaned up their act, should they be punished? I'm sorry, you don't punish the present for the past when the past has already paid the price. But Harry is piling on the pressure. which in his justification is payback time for imagined slights. That is the mark of a very disturbed individual. Harry is, by his own account, has so misused drugs that he is drug-addled and not capable of rational, constructive thought. If ever anybody needed to get into the 12-step program, it's Harry. Also, he is not only attacking in his father's courts, his father's staff, he is also, and his brother's staff, he is also attacking his late grandmother's 2 private secretaries who always functioned on her behalf. So Harry is actually tilting swords at the ghost of his grandmother. And he doesn't mind that he will be possibly traducing his grandmother's reputation. Well, he didn't mind when he and that frowsy wife of his got their henchmen in Netflix to accuse the Commonwealth and therefore his grandmother of a racist update on the empire, which had become Empire 2.0, which was the Commonwealth. And that it was basically an institution that had been created so that the wealth of black people could be siphoned off by rich white people like the English and the British. I mean, it's all there in the Netflix show for those of you who want to see it. But the 2 private secretaries, Lord Geit and Lord Young, formerly Sir Christopher Geit and Sir Edward Young, they did not function autonomously. They fulfilled the will of the head of state. Also, Harry is seeking to violate the right to confidentiality that a monarch has, as he or she, or any other head of state has actually, as he or she sets about the business of ruling or reigning. Queen Elizabeth II understood only too clearly that one of the cornerstones of the British nation's well-being was a free and vigorous press. You cannot have a proper democracy without a free press. She understood this. Therefore, she set about through Lord Geit and Sir Edward, now Lord Young, to, insofar as it was possible, mend fences without destroying one of the large newspaper groups in the country. That is called responsible governance. Harry is trying to make out that it was something shady and shifty. He is a total disgrace. Total disgrace. You only need to look at his performance with that tattooist, using foul language, speaking about his posterior and calling it the second part of the jackass that he is, using the S word, using the F word. All of this while supposedly promoting the Invictus Games, sorry. If one of the veterans conducted himself in such a low, undignified, crass way, vulgar and obscene, he would be traduced. But Harry thinks it's commendable. You talk about drug-addled. But you know, I actually have to say, the monarchy deserves some responsibility for the ongoing embarrassment that Harry is. Because he is still the Invictus Games patron, notwithstanding the fact that he is an embarrassment and that he has been attacking his family as his wife has been, and therefore the British nation, and using the courts in the most irresponsible and destructive ways possible. The king should insist that Harry be removed as patron of the Invictus Games. First of all, the Invictus Games were never his idea alone. It was not his idea alone. In fact, it was a creation of a group of them, including Prince William and Catherine. Let's remember that. And his private secretary at the time. He is an embarrassment and he needs to be removed from any official function that would allow people to think that the monarchy or the British nation are colluding with his behaviour. Now, also, what's really interesting about the lawsuit is that 39 people have settled. The only two left standing are Harry, who was offered a settlement many years ago and turned it down. Let's remember that. So this is totally unnecessary. And Tom Watson. Well, Google Tom Watson. He's now Lord Watson. He is a national disgrace. He is a Labour politician. He was a Labour MP who promoted Carl Beech, who was a fantasist, and the P word comes in, but I'm not going to use it since this is YouTube, who destroyed several people's lives or damaged them and their careers, including the former Conservative MP Harvey Procter. He was a fantasist who accused various people of P activity, and his claims were furthered and promoted by Tom Watson. I'm going to read out what somebody called Ali T says about Tom Watson. The man is despicable, and I'm disgusted that the Labour Party gave him a seat in the House of Lords. Who is behind this case? Who is financing it? In my opinion, it all stinks to high heaven. Does Tom Watson have the £5 or £6 million he's going to have to pay out if he loses? Who's funding him? Interesting question. And well, I know who's funding Harry. Harry has the money. For how much longer is something else. But let's see how this pans out. Because maybe Mr. Justice Fancourt will throw them some victory, as he has been doing throughout. Some victory to them, some victory to the others. I always thought that justice actually required that you don't cut the baby in half. But who am I to come to that conclusion? After all, the wisdom of Solomon clearly doesn't always apply. Windsong says, I'm curious about when the Invictus Games changed from being a British celebration of veterans overcoming the effects of their injuries through sport to an international project when it was a copy of the well-established American Warrior Games. Why must they invade other countries who wish to celebrate their own veterans' achievements? Is this once again all about money? It's about Harry and his supporters creating an international platform for him. That's what it's about. It is scandalous that this has gone from a British charity to something that is being done internationally. It should be celebrated in Britain. But of course, Harry has big ideas, and so clearly do many of his supporters. And let's not kid ourselves. Don't think that there aren't many fifth columnists in the palace, because I can tell you there are. More than that, I don't want to say. Susie Q. Devon says, Shauna from Vintage Read in Australia has an excellent reputation as a commentator on YouTube, highlighted the fact that in the photos of that enormous lily bump black dress, the moon bump was on upside down, even if all she was doing was padding out a real bump to make it look bigger. Well, yes, Meghan's activities while she was allegedly pregnant and she was treating the world to the pregnancy show is exciting a lot of comment at the moment, is it not? And I was actually on Shauna's The Vintage Read program, and she's a wonderful interviewer and she's a wonderful book critic. And she was very nice about Meghan and Harry, the real story, prosecutors or victims. She was extremely complimentary, and I don't think she at first accepted, as indeed I didn't at first accept, the highly irregular conduct to which Meghan Markle disrespectfully treated all of us. Yes, I've looked at the photograph to refresh my memory. It is grotesque, grotesque. I yearn for the day when this farce is brought to an end and we don't have to any longer contend with the, quite frankly, reprehensible and insulting to our intelligence behaviour to which we have been subjected over the years, ever since that bizarre creature came into our lives with her antics and her posing and her really insane conduct. Bizarro World says, is it possible Harry had a crush or was in love with Catherine and that's why Meghan dislikes her so much? Well, sorry. People who know them well say that Harry absolutely adored Catherine and was very open about it. And he was very forthcoming about the fact that he loved her and that she was a sister he never had. I don't know that he was in love with her. I suspect he might have had a teensy-weensy bit of a crush on her. But I think what he really wanted was a replicate of what William and Catherine had. He wanted his own woman that would love him and he would love. And Meghan very quickly realized that there was no way that she would be able to create the hold that she has demonstrated to us she has over Harry if she didn't loosen the apron strings with William and Catherine. And let us remember that Meghan said that William and Catherine were very welcoming to her initially. She said it in her engagement interview. She, of course, has since said that that was a lie, not in so many words, but by contradicting herself. I think it was all about domination and control, and she understood that there was no way that she would fit in. She can't have fitted in. Meghan is such a crass vulgarian and opportunist, and such a hustler, and such a devious manipulator, and such a calculator, and really the antithesis of everything that nobility should be about, that there was no way she was ever going to be able to fit in, any more than she fitted in at Suits, because I am told by people, because my children are friendly with someone who actually moved in that circle in Toronto. Meghan was deplored and disliked intensely for her pretentiousness and her pushiness and her rudeness. So even in that narrow little sphere, she was not ever the shining light that she would like people to believe that she was. I think Meghan dislikes Catherine because Catherine is everything Meghan would like to have been and wasn't. Catherine is tall and slender with a model's figure. Meghan is short and squat with a really rather unfortunate figure. She is straight up and down with the legs of a turkey and the feet to match. She doesn't have a good figure. Catherine has a naturally good-looking face, Caucasian good-looking face. Meghan has an unnatural looking Caucasian face that she shifted so that she would erase all of her African genetic material visually, and succeeded in doing so. Catherine, according to people who've known her since she was very young, is a really nice, kind, intelligent, modest individual. She's loving, she's loyal. She doesn't have the force of personality initially that Meghan does, because Meghan is all show but very little go. Catherine is a lot of go and very little show. But Catherine is everything Meghan would have liked to have been and isn't. I think it's called insane envy. Karen Morris says, the entire country of the United States expressed its disapproval of entry into the war prior to the terrible wars that destroyed the Middle East balance of peace. But they didn't care. They are bent on war. It's profitable for them against the world of the people, and it's happening this time again with the Biden administration. Let's hope and pray that, as you said, it's not impossible for the next administration to change it. Well, Karen Morris, well spotted, and I think it's very important to make the point to Democrat supporters that a lot of the Middle Eastern adventurism took place on the previous Republican administrations. You need to read, sorry, you need to read Hubris by Jonathan Haslam if you want to understand what not only happened in Ukraine, but really what American foreign policy was in the Middle East as well. And let us be clear about it. It's not the people of the United States who bear any responsibility for this. It is some of their elected representatives. Yes, we in Britain also expressed disapproval of our country going into Iraq. Remember the weapons of mass destruction, Hans Blick, and he couldn't find them, and George Bush and Tony Blair were insistent that since you couldn't find them, that was proof that they existed. And let's not forget Dr. Kelly, who lost his life, very mysteriously managing to, shall we say, pass blades across his arteries, but no blood found where his body was. All very mysterious. Well, I don't know when people are going to wake up to the fact that it is our duty as human beings, not only to our families and our friends and our relations and ourselves, but to the world at large, to treat everything politicians tell us with suspicion. It is so important, especially nowadays, that the internet exists and there is access to information that there was never before, that we understand that we are usually fed lies by our politicians, so that they can prosper irrespective of whether we suffer or not. We, the people. Pat Claus says, I was unaware that the US put the kibosh on the supposed peace negotiations between Putin and Ukraine. This is unknown to me. Why would we have done that? Money. It's as simple as that. Money. Successive American governments, Clinton, Bush, Biden, have not cared about the ultimate interests of Europeans or the ultimate interests of Asians, Middle Easterners, so much as their own, what they perceived as national interests. That's their justification, and it has some merit. But to sacrifice stability on another continent just so that the powers will remain the only existing superpower, first of all, it's delusional. If anybody studied history, they'd know that all superpowers peak, whether it was ancient Rome, the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, the French, now the Americans. Do you think in a century from now, America is going to be the superpower? Because I think there's very little evidence of that happening. We all need to live with each other. We need to respect each other, and insofar as it's possible, get along with each other. The world has reached a stage where weaponry is so devastating and deadly that we cannot afford, if we are going to survive as a race, to have the human race, that is, to have a massive conflagration. As Einstein said, he doesn't know what weapons will be used in the Third World War, but it will be sticks and stones in the Fourth. Now, if hawks think that saying that because Russia reclaimed Crimea, which incidentally was always Russian and always being from the time it ceased being a Khanate and became a part of the Russian state under Catherine the Great. It was never Ukrainian until Khrushchev, against the Soviet constitution, transferred its ownership to Ukraine. And the Russians have quite rightly always said that, sorry, the Crimea is a special case, and we expect you in the West to understand this, and we in the West said we did. Let us remember that one of the things we did was we agreed that with Russia, the Russian Federation, that all of the states of the former Soviet Union would not join NATO and would not join the European Union. Russia stood by and allowed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to be absorbed in 2004. Estonia is about 75 miles from St. Petersburg. Estonia is a part of the European Union. Estonia is a part of NATO. Russia has said all along, Ukraine has to remain neutral, and we expect that because the Russian fleet has always had its base in the Crimea. You cannot have NATO having missiles pointing in the direction of Russia on Ukrainian soil and think that it was ever going to be acceptable to the Russians to have access to their naval fleet somehow disappearing. I mean, it is as which bit of Kennedy was right and Khrushchev was wrong, and Kennedy understood and handled the Cuban Missile Crisis properly, as did Khrushchev. Which bit of that don't people understand? Or do they think that the United States of America is so special that it should have its missiles in Ukraine pointing in the direction of Russia when it objected to Russian missiles in Cuba pointing at America? It's beyond belief that people don't understand and don't want to understand. And the Russians have always made it clear that Ukraine, they would respect Ukraine's sovereignty as long as Ukraine remained neutral, was not a part of the EU, and was not a part of NATO. And if we, the West, tried to make it that would be a casus belli. They have said it all along. They have said it consistently and for good reason. We are the ones who have created this situation. We being the West. We are the ones who are responsible for creating this situation. It couldn't be simpler. Either Kennedy was wrong or Russia has a point. You can't have it both ways. It's as simple as that. And I'm not anti-democracy and I'm not anti-the West. I certainly wouldn't want to be living under a regime that deprived me of my civil liberties, which could happen if there are other states that take over. But I'm sorry. Other states have a right to their national interests as well, and it is incumbent upon us to respect them. And you may think that your children, if you are a supporter of warfare, that your children and grandchildren's lives are worth sacrificing so that Ukraine, which the Russians have always insisted was a special case, because let's remember, Ukraine in Russian is border. The Russian state started in Kiev, which is now in Ukraine. The Russian state, Rus, is in Kiev. Rurik was the first leader. Rurik is the founder of the Russian state. It's in Kiev. It then moved over to Moscow. People have no concept of what they're talking about when they are trying to make out that because Khrushchev did something illegal in 1954, if I remember correctly, that somehow this is binding upon the Russian people. It's not binding upon them. They have refused to accept that it's binding upon them, and they're quite right to accept that it's binding upon them. Would we be accepting that things are binding upon us that are clearly erroneous? I mean, who's going to be giving back New York to the Native Americans? And what about Wyoming and all of the other states? People need to wake up and understand that prejudice does not inform right or wrong. Prejudice misinforms wrong and makes it think that it is right. So I hope I've answered that question. And I know, may I say as well, I fully sympathize with the fact that the Poles are terrified of the Russians, with a good reason. Because under Catherine the Great and Frederick the Great and the Empress Maria Theresa, Poland was dismembered and divided up between those three nations. And Poland was then gobbled up later on as well. Because remember, Britain went to war, the Second World War. We went to war to preserve Poland's independence. Hitler orchestrated a concoction which was supposed to be well, I'm not even going to go into it. You can Google it and read about it if you want. Hitler created a false scenario to invade Poland because he wanted the Danzig corridor, which was German and had been taken away from Germany at the end of the First World War. We, the British, then the greatest empire on earth, we declared war on Germany and stated it plainly that we were entering the Second World War to preserve Poland's independence. 6 years later, what did we do? We stood by as Stalin completely annihilated all opposition in Warsaw. We didn't do anything to help the Poles, and we allowed Stalin to occupy Poland. So, all those lives that were lost by us were lost for what? Because our reason for going into the war turned out to be a fiction. Now, I'm not justifying Hitler. Don't for a second think I am. I'm simply trying to make the point that if we went to war to preserve Poland's independence, why did we stand by and allow Stalin to gobble up Poland? You see the anomaly? Now, of course the Poles are nervous of the Russians, and the Poles are always thinking that the Russians are going to gobble them up again. But the Russians have made it absolutely clear they have no interest in Poland. They have no interest in the Baltic states. If they had had an interest in them, they would not have stood by and allowed all these states to join the European Union and NATO. Russia has been extremely consistent in its foreign policy and straight, both straight and straightforward. We are the ones, we the West, who have been inconsistent. And for instance, with the Minsk protocols, we then proudly announced that we had deceived Russia and we had no intention of abiding by them. Excuse me, what gives us the right, us being the West, to behave in a dishonourable manner and then somehow claim that we are on the moral high ground? I think that the matter has to be dealt with in a proper peace conference, and there is very little doubt in my mind that if matters come to a conclusion, that the Crimea will remain as it has always been Russian. I think it is very unlikely that in anything but total defeat of the Russian Federation that the Crimea will ever be handed back, because it wasn't supposed to be handed to Ukraine in the first place. And also, let's remember, Ukraine is not a fixed state. Ukraine is a creation, to a large extent, of a state that existed gratis Lenin in 1922. A lot of parts of Ukraine are Polish, parts are Austrian, parts are Russian. And let's not forget that if we want peace, we have to guarantee that Ukraine will be reconstructed and remain neutral, like Switzerland. Anything else is folly, and Zelensky has played a brilliantly executed hand in PR. But do you think the Ukrainian people who are dragged out of clubs and frog-marched into the army are going willingly? Look at the footage. I am as concerned about the Ukrainian people as I am about my children's welfare and the welfare of all young men who could be drafted into the army. People are absolutely crazy if they think that any American life, any British life, any Ukrainian life is worth the devastation that has taken place, simply because we, the West, wanted to put missiles in Ukraine when the Russians said, we are perfectly happy to have Ukraine remain an independent national state, and we respect its sovereignty, but you must also respect our rights. And we said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to push, push, push. No, I'm not saying that Putin should have invaded. I think that could well be termed an error of judgment. But That doesn't mean that we should go to war. We, being the British, the Europeans, the Americans, anybody else, I don't think my children's lives should be sacrificed for something that can be resolved very simply on a peace table. And we in the West need to get rid of our prejudices and our fears. It's as simple as that. And this is not about appeasement. This is about peace and survival of humanity and civilization. And anybody who thinks it's not is absolutely out to lunch. Pat Claus says, I fervently hope and pray that the US will not be drawn into World War III. That is insanity and it must stop. Oh, it's the second part of Pat Claus's comment. Well, I couldn't agree more. I just argued that. And we're going to wrap up very quickly with one or two more, which is D. Gatz says, Putin has warned us. Our people don't want this. Peace is the only solution. If Biden tries to start a war for Trump to deal with, we will remember who actually started it. Well, we'll only remember it if we survive it. Let's be clear about that one. And there's no guarantee that we will survive it. Eleanor Mahoney says, and here we go, understand that Trump plans to turn over Ukraine to Russia when he takes office. Rubbish. Trump's way of ending the unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine. Sorry, it was not unprovoked. The West has spent the last 30 years provoking this. Don't think it's unprovoked. It was totally provoked by the West. Don't take my word for it. Listen to Professor John Mearsheimer. Listen to Professor Jeffrey Sachs, both covered in honours. Listen to Professor Jonathan Haslam. Utter rubbish, unprovoked. So, Lady C, you are missing the big picture. No, darling, I'm not missing the big picture. Anybody who writes something like this is not only missing the big picture, but isn't even in the art gallery at all. Trump wants to just sell out Ukraine and all the world's sovereignty. Please. Please. The American state orchestrated a pro-Western government after toppling unlawfully a pro-Russian government, because Ukraine understood that it was in its best interests to get along with both Russia and the West. We're the ones who buggered it up. Ukraine didn't bugger it up. The Ukrainian people didn't. They voted in a government that was going to straddle both sides of the divide. We are the ones who ruined it for them. And you're daring to say that it's unprovoked? We have created this problem. I'm not missing out on the big picture. And nobody wants to sell out Ukraine and all the world's sovereignty. Sovereignty. The USA is to become an autocrat's dictatorship. I doubt it very much. We are not dealing with normal times or normal people. No, we're certainly not. But you need to deal with reality. You will see how the USA will no longer exist as it is now or in the past. Trump wants a power crown on his hand. End stop. I'm sorry, Eleanor Mahoney. I don't agree with a word you say. Nothing you say is borne out by anybody who actually looks at the matter with discernment. You need to actually start to listen to your powers of reasoning instead of claptrap. And we're going to end with what Lydia Berlot says. Or it might be Berlot, because it's Berlot would be French, Berlot would be if it's Russian, and it's Lydia is spelt in the Russian way. Hello, Lady C. I have not been able to find a single mention in the mainstream media of the suspicious circumstances under which Vladimir Sharov died. He was, of course, the principal dancer of the Mariinsky Ballet. I know him to have been opposed to the war with Ukraine, voicing opposition to the idea of war. Any war, which is understandable. Losing such a talented dancer has broken my heart. Knowing your deep understanding and love for culture, I was wondering if maybe you have thoughts on this matter. I certainly do. Surely a country should avoid sacrificing its very best simply because they disagree with war. Absolutely. Now, the situation is a little bit more complex than people realize, but in fact, yesterday there was a wonderful obituary of him in the Telegraph, a fine obituary. Now, I think I actually saw him when I was in Russia in 1994, when I was going to buy a flat in St. Petersburg, and I was offered actually the Alexandrovsky Palace near the what was his name? Count. He was Catherine the Great's illegitimate son. I can't remember his name. Anyway, I was offered the palace and I wasn't interested in it. They wanted to sell it to me on a 49-year lease for $1.2 million US. I thought, I certainly don't need a palace in St. Petersburg, and certainly not on a 49-year lease. And I told them I'd buy it on a 99-year lease, but not on a 49-year lease, because I needed for it to last in my lifetime and my children's lifetime. And they said, no, the law said 49-year lease maximum. But I was then taken by some people to the Vaganova school, which was where he was at the Vaganova school. It's where the Mariinsky Theatre, and I think in those days it was still called the Kirov, but prior to that it had been the Mariinsky, and it's now the Mariinsky Theatre and Ballet Company. And I was shown the whole of the school, and very interesting. And he would most likely have been one of the students. Magical dancer, absolutely magical. Obviously, I saw him later. I wouldn't remember who he was, but he was a wonderful, magical performer. He was born on the 9th of February 1985, so he was coming up for 40. He fell from the 5th floor and he died very tragically. He was due to have an operation on his spine on Monday. And I'm going to read out what one of his fellow Russian dancers said. Her name is Irina Baranovskaya. She said that he went out onto the balcony to get some air and smoke and lost his balance on the very narrow balcony. Well, the Russians have said, and it could be disinformation, but that he had been struggling with drug and alcohol problems. I don't know that I necessarily believe that, but it certainly wouldn't be unique, let's put it that way. But dancers have really tough lives, especially if they are as brilliant as he was, because he was the lead male dancer at the Mariinsky Theatre Ballet Company, and that is the finest ballet company in the world, acknowledged by all the other ballet companies and all the great dancers. Well, did he commit suicide? Did he fall? Did he slip? It certainly is awful, whatever happened. But if he was going to, and the word in ballet circles is that he was going to have an operation on his spine on Monday, and he was extremely distraught about it because he was worried that his career had come to an end. But clearly, if he had spinal problems, if his career hadn't come to an end, certainly the major part of it might well have come to an end. Also, he was getting older. 39 for a male dancer, 20 years at the top. I'm not saying he did commit suicide. I'm certainly keeping an open mind on the whole matter, but I really think it's a bit of a stretch to think that he was pushed off the balcony by the Russian state, because in 2022 he said something which has to an extent been used in the Western press and used by his critics to try to discredit him, and it didn't discredit him. And this is important to remember, because he continued to dance for another 2.5 years. So if he had been discredited, he would not have been allowed to continue to dance. So this is really important, where people see conspiracies that don't necessarily exist. He posted, because like many Russians, he had a foot in the Ukrainian camp, and many Ukrainians have a foot in the Russian camp. Hence why it was so important that they had a government which they had of their own free elected right before their pro-Russian government was toppled by the West. So he said, I am against the war in Ukraine. Everybody, I've got news for you, is against the war in Ukraine. Everybody who is thinking is against the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is not something that anybody is in favor of. But I continue. I am for the people, for the peaceful sky above our heads. Politicians should be able to negotiate without shooting and killing civilians. For this, they were given a language and a head. My grandfather, Anatoly Filimonovich, graduated from school in Ukraine with a gold medal. My great-grandmother, Sonia, lived all her life in Kiev. It is impossible to look at everything that is happening today without tears. I want to dance. I want to love everybody. That's the purpose of my life. I don't want wars or borders. That was a sentiment that was not something that anybody should disagree with. I don't think people understand it. The Russians have not set about to conquer the Ukrainians. If they wanted to do that, they would have done it in the first week. They had a very limited military objective. This was a warning shot across NATO and the West's bow. Stop with threatening to have weapons of mass destruction pointed at us, missiles pointed at us. That was their message. They stopped short. They do not and never did want to occupy the whole of Ukraine. They wanted Ukraine to remain independent and neutral. This is a nuance that, for some reason, has escaped people in the... Do we really want to have a third world war to justify our right to do what Khrushchev admitted was wrong when he tried to do it against the Americans? I leave you with that thought. And let's also remember that Khrushchev is the person who illegally handed over the Crimea to Ukraine. And on that note, I'll say, I hope this has not been too distressing for you to listen to. And I think it's important that we understand what the true issues are before the warmongers call upon your children and my children, your grandchildren, and the grandchildren I will hopefully one day have, to fight a pointless war. It couldn't be simpler. The peace table, Ukraine's sovereignty and neutrality are agreed permanently. As simple as that. It's not that difficult to achieve. And I am stunned that people think that in this day and age, with the sophisticated weaponry that exists, that man is going to be able to survive the Holocaust that the warmongers are hoping to unleash, because man is not going to be able to survive it, or most people won't survive it. And on that note, I'll say thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been of some interest to you. Please keep the questions and comments coming in so I will know what you would like us to be speaking about. Thank you so much. Take good care and Godspeed. And if you have truly enjoyed this, please like, share, subscribe, press the notification bell, and take good care. Bye-bye.